no better person to lead us off here. And then Brian Sullivan, he's the president of the Nassau County Correctional Officers Benevolent Association. Nice enough to give us a couple of minutes here on this Friday morning. Sir, how are you? Hope you're well.
Good morning, Jay. I'm doing very well. Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me on. Beautiful Friday morning.
No question about it. And Brian, you're the perfect guy to talk about this. You know, this human rights law, 18721. You want to get technical regarding this thing. And quite frankly, I'm confused. I'm not really thrilled about it. You know, with the vote August 2nd thereabouts from the legislature, folks, we're talking about protecting first responders so that they can have a little pushback, that in the form of a lawsuit up to $50,000 and whatnot, because what we have seen in the past, I can't figure it out. Is it okay for a Molotov cocktail to be sent their way, or maybe a brick to their head? My goodness. If you're taking away that right to counterpunch, I don't know what this thing is all about then. Because I had a legislator on, and there's a lot of misinformation about this thing, okay? So you're the guy to kind of help along here, Brian, and quite frankly, you had a 12-6 vote, which I believe was on August 2nd within the confines of that legislature. The county executive vetoed it just a couple of days ago. So, you know, now it comes to the point of finding some strategy as far as an override. You need 13 to kind of put that through, that super majority. Who knows? I don't know if that'll happen. That'll be tricky. But in essence, it's out there. Of course, we've seen everybody chime in on this. Give me your take, sir.
Well, Joe, Jay, I'll tell you, the perfect word that you just used was mischaracterization of what's going on here. It was a very frustrating thing. And what I'll tell you is that this law is nothing new. I mean, first responders have been labeled a protected class in the past. There was actually a law that was put on the books in Nassau County back when they first started throwing water and other unknown objects at police and peace officers. Back in October of 2019, the county executive actually signed a law making it a unclassified misdemeanor punishable by up to 1 year's imprisonment or a fine up to $5,000 for harassing peace officers and police officers or first responders who are in the process of their duties by throwing water or anything on them. That passed the legislature unanimously back in 2019, and the county executive gladly signed this into law in the county. But what happened here is they added another civil component to this law. If you should harass or menace or assault police or peace officers, the correction officers that I represent, in the course of their duties, there's that they're all obviously criminal laws already, and there's criminal process that would go along with that. But this law would simply add a civil component under the human rights law that you could sue for anywhere between $25,000 to $50,000 if you were injured in the performance of your duties. Now, you know, several groups came out and demanded that this thing it's an affront to discrimination laws, it's an affront to everything else, and that you should not be able to sue because it's gonna impede their First Amendment right to free speech to protest. And that is 100% false, and that narrative was allowed to go on throughout that hearing last Monday, a week ago Monday, and it's actually been fostered throughout since then. A lot of national headlines that this thing has gotten. I was getting reached out by people in Chicago and Seattle because this thing apparently went national. That it still has this narrative that it violates the First Amendment right to free speech. It violates people's rights to peacefully protest, to go out and protest. I'm a union leader. I've protested, I can't tell you how many times at the Nassau County Legislature in Albany. But it's not about protesting. It's not about your right to free speech. It's about unlawful behavior, criminal behavior that occurs during those protests that we all saw, you know, back during the riots and the protests last year. That if you injure any first responder in the performance of their duties, there's another tool that we could use in the toolbox to go after people that commit crimes, that commit unlawful acts against first responders. Now, you and I spoke about the HALT legislation, HALT. It's in corrections next year. This is going to take place where you cannot separate or segregate people in correctional facilities it's basically bail reform inside jails, that you can't separate people, you can't separate violent people or psychotic people or even protective custody. I was all for, and I am still all for this law, because you have to have tools in your quiver to use again to make people think twice before they think they can ever put their hands on a law enforcement officer. And it's still, it bothers me to this day, even though the county executive has vetoed this, because it was portrayed through the state attorney general's office that it's not constitutional, it's not this, it violates people's rights to free speech, and there's a lot of constitution. That was framed 100% wrong, and what I'm hoping is going to happen here, I don't believe an override is going to happen, because it was such a flashpoint, and again, once you start talking about social issues and racial issues, and of course, this is an election year. There's an election coming up in a couple of months. Nobody wants to trigger something that's going to cause some sort of civil unrest. And I don't want that either, obviously. Now, nobody's going to downplay where all of this stuff started with this George Floyd incident and, other incidents of law enforcement misconduct. But that does not, everybody disavows things like that, but those acts of misconduct by law enforcement, and I'm going to say it, that as few as they are in the overall scheme of things, they can never justify in any circumstance the vilification of law enforcement and any acts of violence whatsoever against law enforcement, including correction officers that I represent. I mean, if you can stand there and say that law enforcement cannot have the same constitutional protections and our members are going to be left open to injury or harassment without any recourse, that undermines everybody's civil liberties in this country. And when I got up and I spoke at that legislative hearing, it was a hostile room. It was a very hostile room. There were organizations there that are righteous organizations that they fight for social justice and everything else. But there were obviously plants in the audience that were just there to disrupt the proceedings. They didn't want to hear anything that either I or anybody else in law enforcement had to say. They didn't want to hear what the legislators had to say. When I got up and I said specifically, shouldn't law enforcement have the same constitutional rights and protections as every other citizen, this one gentleman in the middle of the audience stood up and he goes, "No, you don't have a right to that. You took that job. You just basically deal with what you got to deal with." And that just shows you the ignorance of somebody at a hearing that's going to stand up and say that they demand civil rights and they demand anti-discrimination, anti-harassment laws, but at the same time they're going to say that I'm denied because I wear a uniform, I'm going to be denied the same thing. And I just don't understand this. This thing, we stood there, and every one of the speakers that stood there that day said this was all about everyone keeping their First Amendment right to free speech. This law only pertains to adding a civil component to people who engage in unlawful criminal behavior.
And that's all it is. The most dangerous component in anything these days, no matter what you hear, including the vaccine stuff, is misinformation. That's what gets me going. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to make it my business to get on those legislators who need this thing, okay? The 6 or whatever it is. I'll find out. I'll get them on. I'll at least invite them on, because to me, they're misinformed.
They are.
And that's what makes this thing so troubling to me. And I'll tell you another thing. There's misconception I spoke about earlier today, Brian, regarding irrefutable presumption, okay? That's a misconception, folks. And that means that first responders can bring a claim without having to prove their case. That is an absolute misreading of this law. I want to emphasize that. Anyone accused would have the same rights as any other civil defendant in any other situation.
Right.
As with any other plaintiff, Brian, tell me if I'm wrong, first responders will still have to prove each and every element of their claim of assault, menacing, whatever it is, including intent. And really, the presumption makes the common sense judge. Common sense. Okay? I want to emphasize that too. That if you are found to have committed an offense against a first responder under the law, while they're wearing a uniform, you are presumed to have had an awareness that they indeed are a first responder, were motivated by that awareness. Listen, everybody needs to understand the elements. What Brian said was absolutely 1,000,000% true, okay? We are not talking about the curtailing of the rights of free speech and peaceful protest. There are no limitations on those rights. The main thing is state emphatically that you cannot physically injure a first responder during a protest and cannot violate the state penal law statutes prohibiting assault, harassment of men and say, I mean, come on. I mean,
100% true.
It is so frustrating when I read this stuff and you decipher it properly, and anybody can. Clerk item 18721, folks. Check it out. Look it up. Okay, I implore those 6 legislators to get educated and figure it out, because this is harmful as could be. Harmful. And I'm going to elaborate more when I get the county exec back on.
I felt pretty bad for Josh Lafazan, who was the legislator that put this legislation through. He wrote the thing in the beginning. What makes me laugh is he had 2 co-sponsors of the bill. Josh is actually an independent. He caucuses with the Democrats on that side, and there were actually 3 other legislators that co-sponsored this bill. Arnie Drucker, Delia DeRiggi-Whidden, and Ellen Birnbaum. They got up there, and after this long contentious hearing a week ago Monday, Drucker and Birnbaum basically, in my mind, folded like a house of cards. They fell to the nonsense, the false narrative of what was going on. They're concerned about their elections coming up. I'll give Delia DeRiggi-Whidden, who's a Democratic legislator, and Josh Lafazan, I'll give them a lot of credit. They stood by their guns. I mean, it was, I'm not going to say it was a feel-good bill, but it's kind of akin to that, because a lot of this stuff is already on the books, but it added, like I said, this civil component. And the false narrative that went out about this, and 2 of the co-sponsors at the time of the vote dropped off. It's like they ran and hid. One of them actually said, I didn't do my due diligence. I really didn't know what this bill was about. You co-sponsored the bill. How can you sit there and say you didn't do your due diligence when you co-sponsored the bill and helping write it, and felt like a house of cards? But the 2 people, Delia DeRiggi-Whidden and Josh Lafazan, I'll tell you, I give them a lot of credit. All of the Republicans sponsored it because, it's a law enforcement bill, and they usually support and back us on any pro law enforcement bills. But I'll give these 2 a lot of credit. And now, we said before, I don't think there's going to be an override. What I'm hoping is going to happen here is that they're going to rework the bill, and they'll put some stronger language in there that'll show unequivocally what the intent of this bill is, that there are no constitutional questions. There are no, it doesn't pertain to there was a question of whether it pertains to all first responders in Nassau County, which means the county attorney and the county itself would have to take actions against, on behalf of volunteer firefighters and volunteer things like that. That has to be cleared up in the law, but that really wasn't part of what was argued. Just rework the bill, strengthen the language, make sure everybody on the planet knows that this is a civil component and it's all after criminal components are already done. And I don't see what the issue is with this. And if there's continued just vilification of saying that this is insane and you can't do this for law enforcement, then to me it's nothing more than just anybody that's against this, they're just cop haters and correction officer haters and first responder haters, because you can't stand there and say you're an advocate of human rights and anti-discrimination, but you want the same to happen to people in uniform. It makes no sense.
And by the way, Delia DeRiggi-Whidden has been on a show a lot, and she was on last week and really explained it well. And give her a lot of credit. She's a member of the Nassau County Legislature's Public Safety Committee to begin with. So she is aware as anyone, as far as what this situation is. We're going to get the Druckers on, the Birnbaums, even William Gaylor, who was absent for this vote. You know what? We got to set him straight. I am so tired when I read about this stuff. And you know what? I don't want to hear from a Tracy Edwards, the regional director in NAACP. I respect her a great deal. But to have her say, when I read the paper, it would be best to move on from this ill-conceived, politically motivated, and dangerous bill. Tracy, why? I mean, come on, explain yourself. I want to invite her on. I want to invite Dave Kilmick, president of the LGBT network. I would just say, let it go, he says. This bill should never come up in the first place, quote unquote. It was flawed in every single way. David, I respect you immensely. Have you read this thing? It was flawed in every single way, but especially in including anti-discrimination protections. Nobody is talking that. I can't figure out, it's almost like people want to put words in this thing because when they hear unconstitutional,
right,
that's a filthy word, okay? We're not talking unconstitutionality here, folks. Get with the program and read the bill.
100%. And the gentleman you just said from the LGBT network, he's actually quoted as saying, and he spoke at that hearing, the threat of police officers being attacked and all law enforcement officers being attacked just because they're police officers is a bunch of nonsense, and you all know that. I don't think this gentleman has opened up a newspaper or looked at a news article in the last 2 years. How can you get up there and say that police and peace officers being attacked is nonsense, and you all know that, so you don't need this law? Did anybody just happen to see the other day that girl Ella French was murdered in Chicago? How about the cop, the lieutenant that was hit with a brick during a protest on the Brooklyn Bridge? All of the stuff that's gone on here. People are the cops getting shot in the cars. I have incidents of things going on in the jails all the time where there's just this emboldening of the criminal element under these social issues that the people that are involved in righteous social argument are ignoring. And it's the thing that frustrates us absolutely the most is they ignore criminal activity in favor of just fostering these social issues, and it's insane. You can't have that argument on both sides because you're a complete hypocrite.
It's just moronic to even think, that, to say that the measure could intimidate protesters who want to demonstrate peacefully and would fear retaliatory lawsuits. Stop. Are they the ones who are going to be throwing bricks? Is that what you're fighting for? Molotov cocktails? Hitting guys with sticks? Remember that incident, Brian?
That appears to be the ones that they're protecting.
My goodness. When are we going to wake up? Get informed properly. My goodness. It just drives you crazy. It really does. Listen, I will be watching this. I will vow to get individuals on so that I can educate them properly because apparently these people are not informed properly. Okay? And hopefully some are listening right now.
Or purposely.
And maybe they'll have a change of heart. But I got to tell you, legislators need to get their act together here because they are lawmakers.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, they are law breakers because we will continue to have the mayhem out there if we don't fix it. And that's why you have a lot of individuals, and you and I have spoken about this all the time, Brian Sullivan. People don't want to be cops because we turn the tide here, okay? We favor the thug out there, okay, to get away with stuff. We favor those individuals. Just look what's happened to our great city. My goodness.
It's a disgrace.
Anyway,
Jay, I appreciate
can't thank you enough on a Friday for coming on with us, my friend. Appreciate
Thank you very
it all.
much. Have a good weekend, Jay.
All right, Brian Sullivan, corrections. Listen.
Bye-bye.
You know what stinks, folks, is that people only want to think the way they want to think. Okay? They insert things in their head that they think it is when it really isn't. And we got to change that. We got to change it regarding some of the other things that are happening in our society. But more importantly, with this law, it is so clear-cut to me. Clear-cut. And listen, there's still a chance we'll figure it out, though.